The case study I chose for the midterm was the first case study in the book, Slavery in the Chocolate Factory. I chose this case study because I feel I have a personal connection to it, considering my family and I sponsor a child from Haiti who also used to work in the cocoa bean fields to have money for her and her grandmother. Her grandmother was unable to work, and so the only source of income they had was from the little girl working in the cocoa bean fields. Since she was working in the fields and they had no money, she was never able to go to school and get any type of education. Once we started sponsoring her, she was able to stop working in the field and go to school full time. With the sponsorship, we were also able to help them out at home by providing food and other necessities for them each month. This case study was honestly really hard to read because of all of the awful things that were done to these kids in the third world countries. These children were sold into slavery to work for cocoa bean farmers. They were treated just as slaves were, if not worse, than slaves back in the day. They were beaten, whipped, starved, and even had the bottom of their feet cut if they were caught trying to escape. Around 15,000 children in the Ivory Coast were sold into slavery in the early 2000s. The cocoa bean farmers felt that this was the best way for them to get money because on average they were only making around $2 per day. If they were to have workers that they had to pay, then they would have no money at all. After a while, many of the chocolate manufacturers in the U.S. started to find out about the slavery that was going on in the Ivory Coast. Some of these companies also admitted to knowing about the slavery that was going on and just didn't do anything about it because they were getting the cocoa for so cheap. After that got out, some of their buyers got upset and told them that they would no longer buy their products unless they knew that the cocoa was coming from slave-free fields. Once all of this got out about the slavery that was going on in the Ivory Coast, there were multiple cases that were opened. In 2013, Hershey announced by 2020 that its entire supply would come from certified farms, and in 2014, it reported that 18% of its cocoa supply was certified by the Rainforest Alliance or other NGOs. This is just one example of a lawsuit that has happened since all of this came about. Many others were opened and never closed because they had no idea what they were up against. For some reason, these people were not taking this very seriously because by September of 2010, the industry had only managed to contact about 95 or 2.3% of Ivory Coast cocoa farming communities, and if they wanted to have something possibly be done about it, they would have to contact an additional 3,655 farm communities. Some of the major ethical concerns within this case study would definitely have to be how the cocoa bean farmers were treating the slaves. First of all, there shouldn't even be slaves, so that's an ethical concern right there. Second of all, even though they did have slaves, they shouldn't be treating them like they are. As I stated before, the slaves were just children, so they were between ages like 12 and 16, but sometimes they were even as young as 9, and they were kidnapped from villages in the surrounding areas and then sold to the cocoa bean farmers by trafficking. And then, like I also said before, if they probably didn't even have to do anything wrong. The farmers would whip them, beat them, and starve them, and the ones who were caught trying to get away were severely beaten, and they were locked into solitary confinement, and sometimes even had the bottoms of their feet slashed so they could barely walk, yet they still had to be in the fields, and they still had to harvest those cocoa beans. So that is very unethical. And I also don't understand why no one was doing anything about this, yet the major chocolate manufacturers like Hershey's, Mars, Nestle, and others in the US knew this was going on, yet they didn't really care because they were getting the cocoa super cheap, so then they could still sell their candy or whatever products they had at a decent price and make a lot of profit off of it. Utilitarianism is the doctrine that actions are right if they are useful or for the benefit of a majority. Personally, I do not think this is very right or ethical because, honestly, if you just look at the case study that I just read and I've been going over, yes, using the kids as slaves to work in the fields and harvest the cocoa beans for the farmers, in a way, is for the benefit of the quote majority, because the farmers don't have to pay the kids, so they're getting more profit and they're harvesting the beans a lot faster than if they were just doing it themselves or with the few workers that they might be able to pay. So then, since they're able to harvest more at a time, then it can go into the factory quicker, then it can be harvested faster there and then shipped off to, per se, the US, to the big corporate companies like Hershey and Nestle that can then be produced there and sold in different stores. So in a way, yes, it is beneficial to the majority, but it is not right. It is not ethical for that to be happening because it just goes back on using the kids as slaves. In a way, it would also be better if they were being paid, because then obviously they would not be considered slaves, but they also shouldn't be using people who are any younger than the age of 15, because if I am correct, that is the legal age to be working anywhere at that time in the Ivory Coast, but clearly that is not what is happening. So utilitarianism to me is very unethical, especially in this case study, and they should never go off of this when it includes anything such as slavery or the use of kids. Like Kant's categorical imperative states that commands or moral laws all persons must follow regardless of their desire or extenuating circumstances. In the reading, it states that although slavery is illegal in Ivory Coast and the minimum age of employment is 14, the laws are poorly enforced. We can see that throughout this reading that the farmers really didn't care about that law, and they overpassed it many times when they started buying and selling slaves just so they didn't have to pay anybody to harvest their cocoa beans. Looking at this from the farmer's point of view, they honestly thought that this was the best way for them to be able to support their own families. Since the price of cocoa was so low and they were only making that $2 per day, they wouldn't have been able to pay their workers very much anyways, and if they were unable to harvest very much cocoa in a day, they probably wouldn't have even made that $2 that they're making now. I know it's kind of hard to feel sorry for the farmer considering what they're doing to the slaves and to these kids, but sometimes we have to look at the other point of view to fully understand what is going on. Rawls' fairness principle of distributive justice is described as a society of free citizens holding equal basic rights and cooperating within an egalitarian economic system. Going off of this and his principles for equal liberties, it is also described as each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of an equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. Now, as I think about that and I think about the reading with what all of the kids were put through, I think that the equal liberties principle should be enforced. I also understand that they can't even really enforce the laws of not even having slavery. So I get that it would be really hard to have this be a part of it, or I guess enforced, but I do think that it should be a part of the law because these kids should not have to go through what they do. They're being destroyed at such a young age, and I know that this isn't the only place that this is happening, and it could be worse in other places as well. So I think that the equal liberties principle really needs to have more effect and have more power going along with, obviously, his distributive of justice. These kids need that. These kids need that justice in their lives. Everyone there needs to have justice for what is being done because these farmers should not be doing that. These farmers should be probably locked up for a long time. They should lose their farms. They should not even be here, quite frankly, but we can't always affect or do anything about that. But I do think that something needs to be done. We cannot continue to have these kids just go through this day after day, week after week, year after year. They're being completely destroyed physically and mentally every single day by these farmers. Ethic of care is a normative ethical theory that holds the moral action centers on interpersonal relationships and care or benevolence as a virtue. Pulling out just the word care from all of this, I can go off of many different points in the reading, but I'm going to go off of just how the farmers feel. Relating the word care to the farmers is hard because I know that they don't care. Some might not really like how they are doing things. They might not like how they are using these kids day after day just to get their work done. But I also feel like a lot of them don't give a care in the world about how they're treating them. And all that they think about is getting the money and getting their cocoa beans harvested, sent to the factories, and getting the money. Because in all reality, that's what this is all about. They just want the money so that they can live a better life than anyone else. They want to be able to support their families, but they don't care that they are ripping kids from their homes, selling them to one another, and then using them until they pretty much just die. Because we all know that these kids aren't going to live very long. They're malnourished, they're overworked, they're beaten, they're put into solitary confinement. Like, there's no way that you can just live like that. Virtue ethics is the last point that I will make today, and it is: life is governed by choices of right and wrong and motivated by a sense of pleasure and deterred by a sense of pain. The first part of this I see as more of what the farmers have to do. They make the choice to put these slaves through hell. They could choose to do the right thing and get people who are 14 or older and pay them to do the work. They don't have to have these slaves, but they choose that. They choose to do wrong, which hurts to see and hurts to read about because it happens every day. No matter if we want to think it or not, it is happening right now. The other part of this, the sense of pleasure and deterred by a sense of pain, I know that these kids are feeling pain, but I also know that these farmers are doing this wrong, and some of them might not feel the pain. They might see it as pleasure. They might see all of this as some type of a pleasure, seeing all of these kids out there working day in, day out, sun up to sundown, literally killing their bodies. And they may find pure joy out of it, which is awful. No one should ever live like that. No one should ever think like that, especially to a kid as young as 9. Just like I talked about in the beginning, the girl that we were sponsoring, she wasn't much older than 10 when we started sponsoring her. So how long was she in the fields before we were able to sponsor her and before we were able to help her get out of that situation? These kids don't have that option. They're literally kidnapped, sold, and traded, and trafficked, and all of these other horrible things that they can't get out of. And their parents probably can't do anything about it either because they don't have money to get them back. That's why they were taken in the first place. Because those farmers, those traffickers, they knew what they were doing. They knew that their parents couldn't do anything about it. And that's where they're stuck. They're stuck being slaves unless they can get away. But there's that risk of wanting to get away. And those farmers probably find it funny and they find joy and they find pleasure in seeing those kids go through that. They probably really enjoy beating them and doing whatever else we can only imagine them doing. But that's their choice. They chose to do wrong. In conclusion, I think that there are a lot of reasons and points and facts as to why this entire case study is unethical. From the farmers who have the slaves to the corporate companies who knew what was going on and chose nothing to do about it. I think that there are quite a few things that need to be changed. The laws need to be enforced more, and people need to start caring, because right now I feel like there's a lot of people who don't care what's going on. It's kind of one of those things where it's out of sight, out of mind. Since it's not happening here, they don't really care to do anything about it. I know that it's a really hard thing to fix, but we've done it before, so why can't we do it now?